welcome to today's webinar. My name is Crystel Rynne and I'm the CEO here at HRLocker. I am delighted to have Sarah Hudson with us today from Clover HR. Thank you, Sarah, very much for being here with us today. Sarah is going to bring us through...
Thank you for having me.
Yes, Sarah's going to bring us through the second part of this three-part webinar series, focusing on managing UK-based teams, your legal responsibilities you can't ignore. And I promise you, Sarah will frame it in a way of not being too scary and laying it out in a way for us all to understand. So, Sarah, thank you very much for being with us today. And as always, the question and answer section is open, and please ask as many questions as you can. Put them in there, and I will. Sarah's on the hot seat today, so I'll be delighted to pose her any questions that you have. So, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me for our second webinar today. So this one we're looking at the employment relationship. So the previous webinar we looked at the beginning of the relationship, so getting people into employment. Today we're going to have a bit more of a focus on once somebody has been recruited, they've started with you, and the obligations around that. So just the first slide, really, just to summarise things. So essentially what we're looking at is how we can get the best from people. The way we do that, essentially, is to ensure they're treated well and make sure they feel valued. The more value someone feels, the better output you're going to get as a business. So there are kind of business reasons why we want to do this, as well as, you know, the ethical reasons about making sure that people are comfortable in the work they're doing and what they do at work, etc. So what we're going to look at, we're going to go through some key themes, basically, in terms of the legal requirements. The first one we're going to start with is health and safety. So this is a big one. Essentially, you know, this is making sure that people are safe when they're working for you. So I'm going to just go through the requirements under the Health and Safety Act. So this is the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. This is UK legislation, and essentially this is kind of the go-to in terms of what the requirements are for the employer. So some of the points that are required under the Act is to make sure that you have a copy of it within the workplace. And this is so that the employees can reference that, so they can go and look to make sure that you're fulfilling your obligations, and also they can go and check what their obligations are as well. So your obligations as an employer are to protect people from risk. That is both physically and mentally as well. We can go into a bit more detail on that later. It's to look at how we implement systems to manage that, to make sure that that is in effect within the business, and to demonstrate your compliance with the legal obligations under the Act. So just a point, really, a fairly important point, just to say, you know, if you don't do this, there are quite severe potential consequences of that. So prosecution can be fines, and it can even, you know, go so far as imprisonment if it is to do with something, for example, corporate manslaughter. So there are quite serious consequences around this. So what we're just looking at is the basics, but it is something that is very important that as an employer you have in the forefront of your mind. So we're going to look at some of the responsibilities that the employer has. So I'm going to go through this list. These are the key things, really, to have in mind. So first one, risk assessments. This is essentially how we go about finding out what the risks are for an employer. So what risks there could be within your specific business. And then the risk assessment will essentially, you will find those risks, and then you'll put in place controls to make sure that you can minimize them as far as possible. You can't get rid of all risk. That, you know, is just a common fact. But what the obligation is to make sure that you've considered it, you're aware of it, and you've done everything you can to make sure that your employees are aware of it and the measures are in place to minimize it. you need to ensure that there's consistency in this. So it's no good having health and safety measures at one location of the business and then you ignore it at another one, whether that's because you feel that the setup's completely different or there just isn't the thought that, you know, to do that. You need to make sure that it is consistent across the entire business. Ensuring that employee training has taken place and communication to your employees so that they know their responsibilities as well. They know the importance of this, and people who will be monitoring it know what they need to do in terms of that monitoring. As part of the whole process of putting risk assessments in place and ensuring that you're covered in these, it's always a good idea to consult with employees as well as safety representatives. So it might be that your employees are more aware of what the risks are than you may be. So it's having those conversations to understand what those risk factors are that they're dealing with day to day. Obviously, this all feeds into the responsibility to make sure that the work environment's safe, to ensure that there's adequate welfare facilities. So by this, we're talking basics here, you know, is there access to a toilet? Is there kitchen space if that's needed? Is there a break room for people to be able to go and put their things or, you know, congregate during their breaks? Is accident reporting in place? And by this, we're looking at, are you recording near misses and accidents? Anything particularly dangerous needs to go under a RIDDOR, which is the reporting of injuries, disease and dangerous occurrences. Now, usually these are quite specific to the type of workplaces where there are quite large risks. So, for example, if you're dealing with chemicals or heavy machinery, but it's worth knowing whether that does apply to you or not. The very basics in terms of accident reporting is that you should have an accident book, and that's the minimum really. There should be somewhere where you can record what's happened and the result, and then the follow-up from any accidents that happen. And final point is about appointing a trusted and competent employee to meet the health and safety duties. So a lot of businesses will have a health and safety officer. That isn't necessarily what you may need. If you're a smaller business, what you might have is an employee who does another role, but part of their role is to look at and be responsible for the health and safety aspects within the business. So making sure, for example, that there is an accident book, that people are trained, and that you've covered risk assessments essentially.
Sarah, I have 3 questions here on that.
Yep.
Just before we move on, if that's okay, is so the first one is, can you give some guidance on what the threshold is for protecting mental health? Physical risk injury is easy to spot, but what are my responsibilities to spot mental health risks?
Yeah, so I'd include this as part of the risk assessment. So in this, I'd be looking at, okay, what are our potential risks? So from that, mental health is a potential risk, and what can we do to mitigate it? So it's really, what can you do that is reasonable? So I would say at a kind of a lower threshold, what is reasonable to do is ensure that employees have someone to talk to. Now, whether that be their line manager or whether it's directing them to an outside company where they can go and have conversations around any struggles that they might have. So making sure that basically they're comfortable to be able to talk to you about those things and they know that that is something that they can do. So they're told essentially, come and talk to us if you have got a mental health issue, and that will be dealt with in confidence. So I'd say that's your kind of minimum of where you stand. Now, if you want to go over and above that, you can look at having mental health first aiders in the business and getting some people trained so that they can spot and deal with these kind of occurrences. That, you know, there is no legislation to say this has to be done, but I think you're looking at kind of on the scale of, okay, what do you want to do as a business? And so those are some ideas kind of around that. Again, then you're looking into the realms of, you can get occupational health involved if you want to, once something's been flagged to you. So it goes essentially from just the communication around an understanding that this kind of stuff does come up and who to talk to, all the way through to actually helping someone find an appropriate person to talk to about wider issues, etc.
And then just a follow up from that is, what are the requirements for a trained first aider to be present? If we only have one and that person works from home, are we in breach?
So I'm not a specialist in health and safety, I will clarify now. So my view on this is your obligations go as far as you can as a business. So if everybody is working from home and your health and safety person is also working from home, it will be a case of communication and how you go about doing that communication. So it's more a case of, have you done your risk assessments for people home-based? Do you know what's going on with them in terms of their working day? Have they got access to people to be able to contact people if there is a problem? Things like that. Ensuring that there's a regular check-in from the manager, so that people don't kind of go missing off your radar for days on end. So it's more looking at how it works for you as a business, not necessarily, oh, there's a first aider and this is them. I think it is worth looking at, okay, if you are a business that the appropriate person to be the first aid rep.
Yeah.
So
I think that the next two questions probably are, I'll put together for you, Sarah, is around that working from home side of things. So how does the legislation expand to cover this off? But I presume it is around that, Sarah. It's do you do your risk assessment and how does that fit in, right?
yes, so it really is looking at tailoring your risk assessment for the fact that you're working from home. So rather than the risks that you'd be analysing being kind of office-based, those risks that you're analysing are around being home-based. So you're looking at things like, have they got an appropriate setup? We will touch on DSE checks shortly in the next slide, I think. But have they got the equipment they need? Are they able to sit correctly in a space? For a person working from home, do they have an office setup essentially? What you don't want is them sitting on their sofa working, because that's going to cause issues to do with their back and things like that. So now we can't go in and say, oh, you're sitting on your sofa, but what we can do is say, have you got a setup? We need to fulfill our obligation to ensure that the option is there for you to work safely. So essentially, in answer to the question, it's just tailoring those obligations around a home-based environment over an office-based environment.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide, which first point there is DSE assessment. So these are some of essentially the three things to highlight to you, really, in terms of possibly the easy things that often get missed. So these are kind of the basics. DSE assessment. So most people who are office-based are using a computer or a laptop or working from a desk. So it's important that we address those needs rather than just looking at, for example, people who are using manual handling equipment and how they're monitored in their use of it, but looking at actually someone sitting at a desk. How are they sitting at that desk? Is their computer at the appropriate eye level? Are we going to be causing them problems in their posture and things like that with asking them to do work? So the way we do this is really quite simple. It's a DSE assessment where they go through, and the person will do that individually. They will go through in terms of their setup, and it will prompt them to look at points. You'll then receive that as the employer, and you can look at actually, are there issues here? Is there further action that needs to be taken? I would say with DSE assessments, often it's missed because people assume, oh, everyone's fine, no one's complained. But actually, assuming that someone knows how their desk setup should be can be a little bit misleading. It might be that they think it's right, but actually it isn't. So the DSE assessment just gives you prompts to follow to look and assess that. And it's really easy to do, and you can find that assessment document on the government website as well. So you can go and pull that off and then make sure that everybody's doing it, just as a real basic kind of level check on how people are working. The next one, and again, you know, it seems really basic, but evacuation procedures. So do people know where to go if there is, say, a fire alarm? You know, have they? It is often assumed that everyone will know, but actually, has the new starter been told this information, or are they just going to follow everybody else? You want to make sure that they really do know where they're going. So, you know, for example, with a fire, where does everybody congregate? Who is the fire safety officer that is going to be ticking them off to make sure that they have left the building, etc. And then the final point really is just to highlight it isn't a tick box exercise. It needs to be reviewed continuously because things change. And a good example is the fact that a lot of people are now working from home. So have you updated your policies and processes to account for that, to look at how you check from a health and safety point of view, how that is going, as opposed to, you know, how maybe it was going previously within an office environment.
And Sarah, just a question here is, can they self-assess or do they have to have a qualified person to do that? And how often would you do it?
Sorry. So for a DSE assessment, it's a self-assessment. So they basically, the employee will fill out the form, and what it might do is highlight, when as the employer, what I would always suggest is you do read that form, because it might be that they've said, for example, no, I don't have a desk to work at. Actually, I am working on the sofa. I don't have a problem with that. It's that conversation with them to say, look, the best thing to do is make sure you are set up correctly. We will help you set your desk up properly, but you know, ultimately it comes down to the individual's choice as to what they do, which is kind of partly why this is a self-assessment. If you have somebody who has issues and you don't really know what to do with that, then you can contact a specialist who will be able to give you guidance on how to support that employee. And in terms of time frames as well, there is no regulation in terms of how often it needs to be done. I would say yearly, you know, just to make sure that nothing's changed, because some things do change. Equally, you might say, actually, I'm going to do it every couple of years, or it's something I'm worried about, I'm going to do it every 6 months. It really depends there on how the employer feels, whether they feel it's an issue or whether there's been changes to work environments. Okay.
And there are lots of questions about home working, but is the employer required to pay for the home working setup, for example, desk, chair, etc.?
It comes down to what's reasonable. So if somebody needs maybe a specific type of chair because they have a bad back or something like that, that's where the employer might want to look at whether they would pay for that as a reasonable adjustment to help that person work. There is no legislation to say, oh, you've got to buy a desk and a chair. It's down to the employer in terms of, you know, what does that look like for them? You know, are they doing that for every single person? How many people do they have? So it will come down to a commercial decision ultimately, and whether that's feasible for a business to do or not. There are things to look into around that, like grants and things like that can be provided. So it's always worth having a little look to do a bit of research into what can be provided by the government into those kind of things as well.
Perfect, thank you.
So I'm moving on to the next subject, which is data protection. So we've covered health and safety as a bit of one of the key points to look at in terms of legal obligations. The next big one, I suppose, is data protection. People are becoming increasingly aware of this, and businesses need to make sure that they're up to speed on it as well. There's been a lot of talk about GDPR over the years, bringing it in, all the changes, etc. It's one of these topics that feels very big, but actually, if you look at it, the obligations are fairly clear and well set out. So, you know, it's worth understanding what those obligations are. So I'm going to go through a few of these points, and just to stress, this is dealing with employee data. So we're specifically looking at employee personal data. So for example, the information you would hold usually with a lawful basis. So that's things like bank details, because you legally need to pay your employees, so you're going to have that information. So this is kind of the stuff we're talking about here today. So you need to have a lawful basis for processing. There are some other factors where you can process data that's not necessarily under a legal kind of, there's no legislation around it. I'm not going to go into that because that gets a bit more complicated, and also it isn't the norm for what most employers would be looking at. So in terms of a lawful basis for processing, make sure you have a clear reason why you're collecting that data. For example, I need to pay my employee, so I need their bank details. I need to send them a payslip, so I need to know where they live, etc. So you've got your reasons why you're collecting that data. Consider data minimization. So essentially what we're saying here is only collect the information that you actually need to use for something. Don't ask a new employee, for example, to fill in a massive form with loads of detail, and actually you don't use any of that. You just file it away somewhere. Why do you want that information? Make sure that there is a reason behind that. Retention policies. So this is basically saying, set out clearly how long you're going to keep that data for. So for example, going back to the I need to pay my employees, I need those bank details. I need to keep those bank details for the entire time that that person's employed. Once they're no longer employed, I then get rid of that information. I have no need to keep it past their period of employment. Some information kept by employers of employees might need to be kept for 6 months or so after employment, just in case there is any contact regarding things that have happened. So it will very much depend on the piece of information, as to the piece of data, as to how long it needs to be kept for. This is where I would say, if there is any concern over this is something where Clover can help with, in terms of looking at, you know, an analysis of all your data and actually producing a spreadsheet document that says, this is the data you've got, this is how long you should keep it for, as standard. Privacy notices. So this is providing employees with up-to-date privacy notices. So essentially this tells them how their data is used and where you store it. I tend to recommend having these, I mean, you should have these readily accessible, but maybe just put them on your website, put them on your intranet, make it really, really easy for people to look at. How are you keeping that data? So you have to detail this. How are you keeping your data? Are you protecting it? Is it safe? So digital records, are you using encryption, sorry? Are they password protected? If you've got physical data, is that kept in a lock cupboard? It's the very basics like this that are often overlooked. You know, do you have everybody's contract in a filing cabinet? Actually, is that filing cabinet safe? Is it locked when it's not in use? And who has access to it? Which moves us nicely onto access limitation. So data should only be viewed by people who need to view that data. So when you review your data protection, who has access to what? Are there people with access to documents that there is no need for them to have access to? In that case, limit that access as far as you can, so that there's less risk of it going awry. Audit. So check what you're doing, you know, do this periodically. Situations change, the law changes sometimes, you know, have you got a regular audit in place that can capture that, so that things aren't missed, or if they are, they can be caught at that point. So making sure that you're remaining compliant with legislation. Training, make sure that people understand these obligations. It's great to have a spreadsheet with who should have access to what, for how long, etc. But if no one knows about that or its existence, it's pointless for you. You need to make sure that all your employees understand their obligations under GDPR, and what data they should and shouldn't have access to. And then finally, incident response. So this is making sure that as part of that training, staff know who to tell if something goes wrong. So if they suddenly realise they have access to data that they shouldn't have, that they know to escalate that, because it's important with data protection that it is dealt with as quickly as possible. So that will lead on to data breach management, which I'll go on to in a minute. But first of all, I'm just going to touch on data subjects' rights. So these are the data subjects are the people whose data you hold. And they are allowed to ask for that data and see what data you hold on them at any point. And that will come through as a subject access request. And the business has a month to respond to that. And by respond, we mean basically gather all the information that identifies that individual as their information and let them have a copy of it so they can see what data you're holding. And this is where we need to make sure that we are only holding data that we really need to hold so that we can justify that if such a request was to come in. That person also has the right to erasure or rectification. So essentially, if they put in a request, they get their information, and then they say some of this isn't correct, then you're obliged to update that data. But more often, it will be a case of deletion. So what they're saying is, I don't want you to hold that data anymore. Again, at this point, I would recommend getting a specialist to come in and look at this for you, because there are some things that can't be erased from a business you are entitled to keep, and there are other things that you're not. So I would say if you get to this stage with somebody putting in a request and asking for erasure, you speak to a specialist to deal with it. So this is more just to kind of bring it to your attention that this might happen. Now moving on to the breach management, so basically what to do if something goes wrong. And, sometimes things do go wrong, and it's often, not on purpose. Someone may send someone's data by accident on an email, try to recall it, they can't. What do you do in those circumstances? So essentially, it is best practice that you have clear guidance set out already on what you would do if there is a data breach. What I will say as well, it will depend on the data. It will depend on the circumstances of what's happened as to whether that needs to then be reported to the ICO. If you're not sure, the ICO have really good detailed guidance on their website to have a look at. So if something does happen, it's always best to go on there and have a look at that anyway, just as a refresher, even if you do think you know. Go through that guidance and see what your obligations are in terms of reporting. And then after any incident, do a bit of a breakdown review. So what happened? How do you stop it happening again? And make sure that you're thinking about how you can improve your processes so that things don't happen again. Okay, so that's our kind of little dip into data protection there. I'm going to move on swiftly on to HR compliance and legal obligations. So what we have here is a list. So it's not an exhaustive list. It's just to give you an idea of the basic things that are obligations for you legally to ensure you're doing. So employee pay information is correct. The employee also does need to make sure that they're updating you on this information, but you again also have to chase it up as well. So do you have up-to-date emergency contact details on file for everybody? Are you keeping to working hours and timekeeping? And I'll go on to that in the next few slides about working hours. Do you have an up-to-date home address? Are the absence records accurately tracked for everybody consistently? Same with sickness records. So absence being wider issues around absence, or wider reasons around absence, sorry, sickness being more specific to health related. Are you updating performance information? So are you having your annual reviews? Are you having more than just annual reviews? Are you making sure that that's all on your systems? Capability records, documented, monitored, again, disciplinary grievances, all these kind of employee relations issues. Have you got your paper trails in order? Have you kept the information that you need, and outcome documents so you know what the position stands with somebody? Health issues, reasonable adjustments. Have you referred things to occupational health if they go beyond what you can deal with from a medical point of view? Do you have all your right to work documentation, job descriptions, role profiles, training and development documents, so you can say what training people have had, you know where you are for all employees on that? List of holidays, do you know who's off and when? So you can make sure that people aren't having more time or less time than they should be having, or simply people booking holiday off at the same time. Have you got systems in place to make sure that that doesn't happen? Do you understand about parental leave and other statutory leave, and are you equipped to deal with it when it comes up? So we've got parental leave repeated there again. I think also we're looking at there are a number of statutory leaves, so parental leave, paternity, maternity, adoption, etc. So do you know about all of those? Employee benefits and pensions, so contractually, what are you obliged to do for your employees? And then termination and exit interviews. So have you recorded everything? Have you done a follow-up if needed into why people are leaving, etc.? So some of these that I've covered in the list are best practice rather than legal obligations, but all of them are very much worth doing and things to think about. Are processes in place to make sure that you've addressed all these? And at the very least, have you considered them, even if you've not put them in place?
Thanks, Sarah. And I just have one quick question before you move on. Now, this have to do with the health and safety side of it is, what is the requirement for manual handling training frequency? And do you need to do a practical assessment that we would have in the Republic of Ireland? Is it the same in the UK?
So yes, my understanding is there does need to be the practical requirements. You have to see them demonstrating that they understand after having done the manual handling training. I don't know the answer in terms of timescales as to how often it needs to be done. So that is something that I can have a look into. So if you want to email me separately, I can have a look at that for you. It will, however, state that on the government website. So they are, in terms of health and safety, the government, the gov.uk website has got all those obligations and timescales, etc., listed on it. So that's where I would go to look for it. And that's somewhere where you might be able to go and have a look yourself. But equally, if you want to email me, that's fine. I can have a look fully for that.
And then Sarah, just one other question just around sick leave. So in the Republic of Ireland now, there is mandatory sick leave has increased to being 5 days and will increase. Is it okay to have a separate policy for employees in the UK?
Yes, that's absolutely fine. As long as you're clear that they come under different legal jurisdictions. And so that's the reason why you've got these two separate policies, then yes, that's absolutely fine.
Perfect. I think that's important to note as well, is that, where the person is employed, that's the legal jurisdiction, right?
Yes, exactly. So it's absolutely fine to have, you can have a completely separate handbook, different policies, as long as it's very clear, on the front page it says who this applies to, then that's absolutely fine.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I'm going to go on to talk about the Working Time Directive. Again, this is kind of legal requirements and information that's really important to know, because it directly affects what you can ask your employees to do, essentially. So I'm gonna run through these points, but again, I will say all this information is really clearly stated on the gov.uk website. If you just, they have fact sheets on working hours, so it's all broken down on there for you. I'm going to run through kind of the key points. So there's a 48-hour average weekly limit on what people can work, and that's averaged over 17 weeks. However, you can opt out from that. So they can opt out in writing. The opt-outs need to be voluntary. So you can't pressure them to work more than those 48 hours if they don't want to. But if they're happy with that, then they can sign an opt-out agreement to say, yeah, that's fine. And you don't need to monitor it so closely. Often these opt-outs will be part of the contract pack that goes to employees. So you can put it in the contract pack with them to say, please sign this if you're happy to, but also to be really clear, they don't actually have to sign it. It's not part of their terms and conditions. Rest breaks. So these are important to know kind of the limits on what you can and can't do. So employees need to have 11 consecutive hours rest in a 24-hour period. In terms of weekly rest, they need to have 24 hours rest each week or 48 hours rest every 14 days, so every fortnight. In terms of in-work breaks, anybody who works over 6 hours straight is entitled to a 20-minute break at the end of that. So often you'll see this, and most people in their contracts will have a 30-minute break for lunch, say, as a minimum, but actually the legal minimum is 20 minutes. Night work. So the definition of night work is at least 3 hours worked between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. So if you work 3 hours within those periods of time, you are a night worker. So for night workers, they can't exceed 8 hours in a 24-hour period. And again, this is averaged over 17 weeks. And night workers will get a health assessment. So you will need to do a health assessment with your night workers before they start and at regular intervals throughout. This is just to check that there are no issues with them working nights, essentially. Paid annual leave. So minimum of 5.6 weeks, that's 28 days per year for a full-time employee, including bank holidays, and that can be prorated where somebody works less hours per week. This statutory leave can't be replaced with pay unless employment ends. So you can't pay holiday instead of them taking holiday. That's not allowed. They have to have that right to, they have to have that time off to rest. And then young workers, so this is anybody under 18. Legislation is different for people under 18. They can't work more than 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week. They have to have 12 hours rest in every 24-hour period, and then 2 rest days per week. And they're entitled to a 30-minute break if they work more than 4.5 hours. So as you can see, it's quite different for anybody under 18. There are also other health and safety requirements around risk assessments that need to be done for anyone under 18. So it is worth double checking if you have anybody under 18, checking what applies for them and making sure that you've covered everything off there. So record keeping, just a real basic point to say, you need to keep records of the hours people are doing. And so, for example, timesheets, clocking in, clocking out, or schedules for 2 years. So you can show compliance with the 48-hour week and night work limits. So basically, this is if you were audited, you'd be able to show, it will go back 2 years. You can show that you haven't breached any of the regulations. And then just a brief note on exceptions, because there are always exceptions to anything like this. So certain sectors have specific rules and they have exemptions. So for example, HGV drivers, their daily rest can be different. They can have, they can reduce it to 9 hours 2 times within a weekly period. So this is to accommodate basically people who have to drive for a really long distance. There can be changes made to their working hours. Things like emergency services, so the NHS, they have slightly different rules around what can be done in order to accommodate basically emergencies for people to have to stay on and work longer if necessary. So they're very specific. They will be industry specific. And if you think they apply to your industry, it's worth just double checking what those requirements are. Again, you can either speak to someone at Clover or have a look on the gov.uk website, which will give you a kind of brief analysis of what will be different.
So I think you're going to answer this question was, does the 48-hour opt-in apply to drivers? So I think that's, if you think that that doesn't, come and speak to somebody or have a look and
Yeah,
see.
it will depend on a number of factors. So if you have drivers, it depends on their shift periods. There are quite a few things that will impact on it. So I would say it's best to get specialist advice when it comes to drivers.
Okay. And then just one of the questions here is there a requirement for daily clocking in and out for office-based workers or home workers?
There's not. So you don't need to necessarily record the time where someone clocks in. It will come down to how you manage it as a business. So what you will probably have is, and what you will probably want to have, regardless of the record keeping, is an understanding of when people are coming in. So, how do you go about monitoring that? So it's worth looking at how you do that. It might be that rather than having a clocking in, clocking out system, you have some kind of record keeping to show when people are late. And equally, through that process, you would monitor, okay, someone's come in late, are they staying late to catch up? Or actually, are people kind of in the office longer than they should be, etc. So it will come down a little bit to just kind of keeping an eye on it in an office environment, but thinking about how you as a business want to be able to manage it and see what people are doing.
Thanks, Sarah.
A bit of a vague answer there, sorry, but it will depend on the business, really.
Yeah, and I would even say that just for ourselves is that if you have an issue with lateness, then that's why a lot of the time why people put in clock in and out systems. But maybe if you're a company where you're happy for that flexible time where people can arrive within half an hour, whatever it is, and stay, that's it is depending on the business there, isn't it? Even a case of maybe you're happy for somebody to have the flexibility around break time, but they work later on in the day. It's individual, isn't it?
It links in quite nicely to the health and safety side in terms of the are you monitoring people? So you don't want your people to be working really late and to have burnout. You don't want them to be doing all these hours that we have no control over. We don't know what's happening, and actually they're making themselves ill, and then you have sickness problems and things like that. So it's a balance. It's trying to understand what works for individuals alongside keeping up with the requirements to make sure that people aren't overworking, essentially.
Thanks, Sarah. Actually, and sorry, just on that before we move on, that's actually really important. I think when people put in clocking in and out systems is that it's important to explain why you're doing it. It's not about making sure that people are working, that they're not late. Sometimes it actually is the case that you're making sure that people aren't, that there isn't burnout, that they're not working excessive hours, that they are taking their breaks, that they're not working 60 hours a week. That health and safety side of it's important.
Yeah, definitely. So just on the last point on the slide, you can modify rest periods where it's justified by operational need, but there needs to be compensatory rest if you do so. Again, this is something that it goes into a little bit more detail than we'll cover today, but again, you can come to Clover for some advice on that, or first port of call, go and have a look at the gov.uk website, because it does lay out all these issues. You'll be able to see from that whether it's something that actually, yeah, it applies to me and I need to get a bit more advice, or whether it doesn't. So next point, and we've just got one slide on this, is performance management. So this often arises in employee relationships, which is why I'm going to talk about it today, even though it isn't necessarily a legal obligation, but it comes into the relationship with the employer-employee. And often there's a stigma attached to it. Often people see performance management and think, oh, that's if someone isn't doing their job properly. And that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's just about elevating a work level, providing support. So it shouldn't be seen as a negative, even though often it is. And that's something that kind of we need to work on within employment cultures to make sure that people understand it's a support mechanism, not a punishment. So the definition of performance management, it's an ongoing process of communication and feedback between a manager and employee to achieve strategic objectives. And these objectives are going to vary. They're going to be varied depending on what the organisation goals are. They're going to look at continuous improvement. So, what are we doing to get better? Identify and support underperformance and recognise and reward high performance. So there's a lot of reasons why you would go down a performance management route, and they really aren't all negative at all. So the core components when you're looking at performance management is goal setting. This is really important to make sure that you're setting it out really clearly for the individual. Their goals are clear, they're measurable, they're aligned to your business strategy, as in, there's a reason why you're asking people to do these things, not just kind of for the sake of it. You have actually analysed why you're doing it. Ensuring that there are regular reviews in this process. Now they can be either formal, which will need to happen, but there can be informal check-ins throughout the process as well. The whole point of it is support. So, the more check-ins you have, the better, really. And it gives an opportunity for feedback, and that should be constructive, which is really important. It needs to be timely, so there's no point having a conversation months after an event's taken place, because that's not going to address the issues that have come out of that particularly well. It needs to be two-way. You need to give that person an opportunity to give their opinions on what has happened and what's gone wrong. Not just say to them, this is what's happened. You need to get everybody's understanding of the situation. Development plans fall into performance management. So this is focusing on upskilling, growth, career progression, and these can be fairly long term. This could be a development plan that lasts over 5 years, 2 years, 6 months. It's very varied depending on the circumstances. And then performance improvement plans also. So these are structured support for underperforming employees. I think these are the things that people think of automatically when they think of performance management. But again, it's not just a negative. What you're trying to do with these PIPs is to get that underperforming employee up to where they should be. And you do that by supporting them, by encouraging them and setting those goals and making sure that everything's very clear. So that's just touching on performance management. It is a long process, often, performance management, because you need to provide those mechanisms of support and review. So it's not, I think it's seen as getting rid of people. That's not what it is for, and it can't be, because it takes a long time to do if you're going to do it properly and invest in it, which I think is worth doing.
I'd agree. I think it's something that people have a negative connotation to, but actually it should be the kind of backbone of how you're strategically planning, and everybody understands their KPIs and objectives and everybody's together. And a lot of the time, I think, Sarah, it's good that you might understand if there's any issues or kind of get ahead of it if there are problems.
It's communication. It comes down to how do you help facilitate communication, and having performance management helps you be able to do that in a constructive way and in a structured way. So I think it is really key, and it's really underused because it has such connotations associated with it, but try and change the narrative on those. Which leads us quite nicely into culture and inclusivity, which is the final slide today. And I think it's really important, and it goes through the heart of everything you do within the employment relationship. And it starts at the top, and it's really all about role modeling behaviours. And that's supported with policies as well that set out expectations, and those expectations will be based on culture and behaviours. So it really kind of, your culture is saying, this is how I want my business to run, this is how I lead my business, and this is the expectation I have of people who are doing the work for me. some things to think about in relation to your business culture. So these are just some examples we picked out to really as kind of points for you to go away and think about. So firstly, EDI equality. So does your business have systems in place to prevent conscious and unconscious bias? Because ultimately that's what we're looking at. You know, we're looking at making sure that people know what to look out for to make sure they're not doing something wrong. Menopause awareness. This is becoming quite prevalent as, you know, people become more aware of it. Would your employees joke about it? Would your managers know how to address concerns about it? Is it something that you're avoiding dealing with because you don't know how to deal with it? Bullying, harassment, sexual harassment. Would you know how to support a victim as well as appropriately tackling the issue that arises that comes to your attention? And how would you find out about it? What process have you got in place to know what's going on in your organisation? And then finally, how would your organisation respond to the Supreme Court's definition of a woman? What policies do you have in place? Do you address it at all? Do your policies look beyond the basic sex binaries to support transgender and non-binary individuals? Or again, is it something that you've shied away from because it can be quite a provocative area? Do you need to address it? You know, will it come to a point where you do have a situation where it should be addressed? So in a way, these kind of points that we've raised, these 4 points, are just kind of something to think ahead to. It might not be that something that affects you now, but that doesn't mean it's not going to affect you in the future. So prepare for how you would deal with it if it comes up. How do you want to deal with it from your cultural point of view within your organisation? So that's it from me. I don't know whether there's any further questions from that.
No, but I think that's the bit, Sarah, that I used to tell people a lot, even when they're thinking of people in terms of working from home or hybrid. It's the same in terms of your what do you want your customer, your cultures, what do you want your company to be? How do you want it? You know, you need to make those decisions now, and sometimes you don't just have to wait for legislative changes. You just need to understand what you want to be, right?
It is very much you set it out, you act it out, and that's how it will filter down. So from it's really important that and it is top down. It's really important that it is, because it just isn't going to, it won't work bottom up. You need to set your boundaries of what your expectations are and make sure then that the people that you have are following that and then being able to manage it if they're not.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. I hope everybody got a lot from that. We're almost at the hour now, so really appreciate and great questions. Will the slides be sent out as well? Yes, they will. And we will see you next week again, Sarah, same time, same place.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody, and talk to you all soon.